I'm Kelly Lambert. I'm 43 years old, a senior systems architect at Caldwell Defense Solutions, and I've spent the last 15 years deeply embedded in some of the most classified, high-stakes defense projects our country has seen. I'm not someone who usually lets emotion rule my decisions. This job demands a calm mind, sharp instincts, and a relentless commitment to precision. For over a decade and a half, I've been the architect behind a $1.8 billion defense system, one that's not just complex in design but critical in national security. I've overseen everything from the initial blueprints to the most sensitive security protocols, ensuring flawless functionality while guarding against vulnerabilities. The system is intricate, fortified by layers of encryption, authorized access keys, and proprietary modules that only I and a handful of trusted team members can navigate. That morning, it was 8:15 a.m. when I was summoned to Human Resources. The hallway felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights buzzing annoyingly overhead as I walked down the sterile corridor to the HR office, an area usually reserved for routine meetings or occasional policy updates, not career-altering conversations. There was a tense, almost clinical atmosphere. When I entered, Laura Simmons, the HR director, sat behind her desk, and the CEO's personal assistant hovered just outside the door, eyes flickering nervously. Laura didn't waste time or offer small talk. "Kelly, we have to inform you that your employment is terminated effective immediately," she said, her tone flat but firm. I blinked, momentarily surprised but not shocked. I already knew this conversation was coming, though not this abrupt. I asked calmly, "May I ask the reason?" "You refuse to train Mark Caldwell," she replied, stating the CEO's directive matter-of-factly. "He needs access to the core system, and your refusal is grounds for insubordination." Mark Caldwell, the CEO's son, a name I'd heard more than I wanted to in recent weeks. The same Mark who lacked the necessary clearances or background to be entrusted with even peripheral access, let alone classified protocols that could compromise the entire system. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. "Understood," I said, my voice measured with no trace of bitterness. I had made a choice, because safeguarding national security and respecting contractual boundaries outweighed any personal risk. Training Mark was not just a matter of inconvenience, it was a direct violation of the strict clearance and compliance protocols I was bound to uphold. As I stood there, listening to the final formalities of the termination process, the retrieval of my security badges, the warnings about confidentiality, the insistence on signing exit paperwork, I was already mentally shifting gears. While outwardly calm, inside my mind raced through every thread of leverage I held. For years, embedded in the contract that governed this $1.8 billion system was a clause they had clearly overlooked. A clause that assigned proprietary ownership of core system modules to me personally. A legal safeguard I had insisted upon during initial negotiations. They'd thought firing me at 8:15 in the morning would leave them with an empty desk and an empty seat in the control room, but they didn't realize the extent of what I still controlled. The architecture keys, digital signatures, and encrypted access points carried my authorization embedded deep within their software ecosystem. Without me, the system couldn't just run, it couldn't be legally operated or modified. I stepped out of the HR office, the hallway feeling different now, more like a battlefield. But I wasn't defeated. I was calculating. In that moment, my mind was already mapping out the moves ahead. The betrayal was sharp, but my response would be sharper. Because in this kind of corporate warfare, calm professionalism and strategic patience aren't just virtues, they're survival tools. I knew this was just the opening move. For the past 15 years, this job has been more than just a career. It's been my life's work, my passion, and the arena where my technical expertise met real-world stakes. I'm Kelly Lambert, and as the Senior Systems Architect at Caldwell Defense Solutions, I've been entrusted with the design and ongoing maintenance of a classified defense system that generates a staggering $1.8 billion in annual revenue. This isn't some off-the-shelf software or a commercial app that can be downloaded and tweaked on a whim. This system is a fortress made of code, hardware, and protocols, engineered to safeguard national security interests and operable only within the strictest of security parameters. I personally designed the core system architecture from the ground up, weaving together complex algorithms, multi-layered encryption, and fail-safe mechanisms that ensure uninterrupted operation even under hostile cyber attacks or physical breaches. Each module was painstakingly crafted, not only for efficiency but for resilience. This wasn't about flashy features or market trends. It was about trust, precision, and airtight security. The system's architecture embodies years of iterative development, countless late nights, and a commitment to perfection that few outside the defense world could appreciate. When I say every line of code matters, I mean it literally. One small error could compromise the entire operation and risk lives. My role extended far beyond design. Over the years, I've led a dedicated team of 12 highly skilled engineers who share this intense level of commitment. Together, we've optimized the system to save Caldwell Defense Solutions more than $12 million annually, a figure that speaks to both our technical prowess and our ability to innovate under pressure. We stripped away redundancies, hardened security layers, and integrated adaptive response protocols that allow the system to learn from emerging threats. It's a living, breathing entity, and I was its guardian. The weight of responsibility is enormous. Working on classified defense projects means holding top-level Q clearances, which in practical terms translates to being one of the very few people with authorized access to the system's most sensitive components. This isn't just about password-protected files or standard cybersecurity measures. We're talking segmented access keys, biometric authentications, and cryptographic signatures that are digitally embedded and verified at multiple checkpoints within the system. My digital signature alone is a key that can unlock, modify, or halt critical system functions. The architecture is so tightly woven with my identity that any tampering without my authorization would trigger immediate alerts and automatic lockdowns. I took immense care in documenting every update, patch, and system tweak. These records aren't casual notes. They're meticulously encrypted archives, stored in redundant, geographically dispersed, secure servers. Every change carries time-stamped signatures and detailed logs that map the chain of custody for each component. This documentation doesn't just serve operational continuity, it's also a legal and compliance necessity because we operate under federal defense contracts that demand transparency and accountability at every level. Losing or mishandling this information would jeopardize contracts worth billions and risk regulatory penalties that could shutter the company. My expertise and exclusive knowledge made me not just indispensable but, in a way, irreplaceable. I've witnessed firsthand how the system's complexity defies simple handovers, especially to those lacking the necessary clearance or technical background. This is where the professional tensions began to surface. The CEO's insistence on bringing his son into this high-stakes environment wasn't just nepotistic, it was reckless. Mark Caldwell had neither the experience nor the clearance to even approach this system's core. Training him wasn't a simple matter of passing on knowledge. It was a breach of every protocol embedded in my professional ethos. I knew the system like the back of my hand. I understood every dependency, every fallback routine, and every potential vulnerability. That knowledge, paired with exclusive legal ownership of critical system components embedded in the contract, was my shield. They could terminate my employment, but they couldn't erase the fact that the system's very functioning rested on my authorization, and that was a fact they had either underestimated or failed to consider entirely. This system was more than lines of code or hardware. It was a fortress built upon years of relentless dedication, technical mastery, and legal safeguards. And as I stood on the precipice of this unexpected career upheaval, I remembered that all the years of my work had created not just a job, but a position of power and leverage that no abrupt termination could simply erase. Richard Caldwell has been the CEO of Caldwell Defense Solutions for 8 years now. When he took the helm, the company was smaller, less specialized, and operating under a different vision, one that prioritized technical excellence and steady growth. Over time, however, Richard's leadership style veered toward aggressive expansion and cost-cutting. His focus shifted to maximizing shareholder returns, sometimes at the expense of operational nuance and personnel expertise. That shift is precisely what led to the current storm. The truth is, Richard has been under a lot of pressure lately, from the board, from investors, and from his family. His son, Mark Caldwell, recently graduated from a well-known university with a degree in business administration, but lacked any real technical or security background relevant to our classified defense work. Mark was eager to join the family enterprise, and Richard was equally eager to secure his son's place in the company hierarchy. There was talk of grooming Mark for eventual leadership, integrating him into the core operations, and presenting him as the next generation of Caldwell leadership. But Mark's entry wasn't just a simple hiring decision. It was a calculated cost-saving measure disguised as nepotism. Richard knew that Mark's starting salary, around $120,000 annually, was significantly lower than mine, which was $250,000 plus substantial vested benefits accrued over years of service. On paper, replacing me with Mark sounded like an easy way to cut expenses, but it ignored the reality of what the job entailed, especially around the classified defense system that generates $1.8 billion in revenue. Mark's lack of security clearance alone was a huge red flag, let alone his complete unfamiliarity with the technical intricacies of the system. Despite repeated warnings from senior engineers and security officers, including myself, that Mark did not meet the necessary qualifications or clearances, Richard pressed forward. He believed that Mark could learn on the job, that the protocols could be adjusted, and that the risk was manageable. This was a grave miscalculation. The protocols governing access to this system are governed by federal regulations and company policies that simply cannot be bent or bypassed. The classified nature of the project demands rigorous clearance procedures and strict adherence to security protocols, rules that Mark did not satisfy. Compounding this, Richard overlooked a critical contractual clause that assigned proprietary ownership rights of the core system modules directly to me. This wasn't just legal jargon buried in a contract. It was a binding agreement that gave me control over key elements of the system architecture, including digital signatures and encrypted access points essential for operation and modification. Richard seemed either unaware or dismissive of this clause, focusing instead on the apparent short-term financial savings. I suspect that he and the HR director, Laura Simmons, worked together to expedite my termination and Mark's onboarding, hoping to bypass any obstacles my ownership rights could present. Laura Simmons played a key role too. As the HR director, she coordinated the termination process with alarming efficiency. There was no due process, no real investigation into my alleged refusal to train Mark, just a quick and decisive move to cut me loose. The usual protocols for handling such sensitive personnel decisions were circumvented, likely to avoid internal disputes or legal scrutiny. It became clear that this was not a standard HR action, but a strategic gambit by the CEO's office to install Mark into a position he was neither qualified nor authorized to fill. The irony is bitter. Richard's ambition to place his son at the heart of a multi-billion-dollar defense system was blind to the complex web of legal, technical, and security realities that govern such work. He underestimated the weight of my ownership rights and the operational dependencies built around my authorization. He disregarded the federal compliance standards that make training unauthorized personnel a potential breach of law. And he failed to anticipate the professional consequences of forcing an unqualified individual into a role that demands not just technical knowledge, but absolute trust and legal clearance. In the end, Richard's motivation was a mix of nepotism, cost-cutting, and perhaps a misguided attempt to modernize leadership from within the family. But it was a move fraught with risk that compromised not just the integrity of the system, but the company's standing with clients and regulatory bodies. These were mistakes founded on ignorance or willful neglect of contractual obligations and security mandates, and those mistakes would soon become the fulcrum for the company's unraveling. As I reflect on this, I'm reminded that in corporate environments like defense contracting, decisions made in executive suites can have ripple effects far beyond the boardroom. Richard's push to bring Mark into the fold without the necessary qualifications wasn't just a personnel issue, it was an operational and legal catastrophe waiting to happen. And the deeper I dug into the situation, the more I realized just how thoroughly they had overlooked the ironclad ownership clause that I held, a clause that would be my key leverage moving forward. After the initial shock of termination, I knew my next step was to dig into the paperwork. The moment I had the termination documents in my hands, I switched to methodical mode, carefully scanning every line, every detail, looking for inconsistencies or anything that could expose procedural flaws. What I found didn't just raise questions, it confirmed a pattern of deliberate deception. First, the performance evaluation included in the termination packet was riddled with falsehoods. It claimed that I had been uncooperative and resistant to leadership directives, with no supporting evidence or prior warnings on record. These accusations contradicted years of documented high performance and glowing feedback from my direct supervisors and clients. It was clearly a manufactured justification, a smokescreen to cover the real reason: my refusal to train Mark Caldwell. Beneath the falsified performance claims, I discovered something even more telling: a hiring notice for my replacement. The notice was dated the very same day as my termination, time-stamped just hours after my meeting with HR. The replacement was none other than Mark Caldwell himself. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a premeditated move to oust me and install Mark immediately. The timing alone suggested collusion between HR and the executive team to execute a swift personnel swap, bypassing any protocols for a proper transition or due diligence. My initial review of these documents was clinical, devoid of emotion, but the real revelations came when I accessed the company's internal email system, something I still had limited access to given that my termination hadn't fully processed yet. Sorting through the messages between Laura Simmons, the HR director, and the CEO's office, I unearthed a series of communications that painted a disturbing picture. One email chain revealed repeated complaints from senior engineers and security officers, all flagging Mark's lack of security clearance and technical qualifications. Yet, HR and the CEO dismissed these concerns outright, with Laura's messages urging expedited onboarding to meet strategic leadership goals. Another email exchange showed Mark himself expressing confusion and frustration over system protocols he was expected to master within days, a near impossible task given his inexperience and lack of access rights. The most critical breach, however, was an internal memo from the company's compliance officer, sternly warning that Mark's involvement in classified protocols without proper clearance would constitute a violation of federal defense regulations. This memo was promptly ignored. The emails revealed a clear disregard for mandatory training standards and security mandates, standards I was legally and ethically bound to uphold. Turning my attention to the original contract that governed the defense system, I revisited the ownership clause that had been my safeguard for years. Embedded within the legal framework was a provision assigning proprietary rights of the core system modules to me personally. This wasn't a generic intellectual property clause, it was a meticulously negotiated clause that granted me exclusive control over the architecture keys, digital signatures, and encrypted access points essential to operating and modifying the system. The significance of this clause couldn't be overstated. Without my authorization embedded in the system, any modifications or access attempts by unauthorized personnel, including Mark, were not just risky, but potentially illegal. This contractual ownership created a legal moat around the system's core functions, making any unilateral attempts to bypass or replace me not only operationally impossible, but legally void. Simultaneously, I reviewed regulatory compliance documentation related to federal defense contracts. These documents outlined mandatory training and clearance protocols, non-negotiable requirements meant to protect classified information and national security. Mark's name was conspicuously absent from clearance logs, and there was no record of him meeting the rigorous background checks or security training necessary for access. His forced involvement was a blatant breach of these protocols. As I pieced together this evidence, I felt no anger, only a resolute clarity. This wasn't about personal betrayal anymore. It was about systemic violations, legal boundaries crossed, and a reckless gamble with national security. The falsified performance claims, the simultaneous replacement hiring, the ignored warnings about Mark's qualifications, and the overlooked ownership clause all combined into a blueprint of corporate negligence and willful misconduct. The reality was clear. Caldwell Defense Solutions had attempted a hostile takeover of my role by systematic disregard for contractual and federal mandates. But they had underestimated the layers of protection I had built around this system, not just technical, but legal and procedural as well. Their move to terminate me without addressing these factors was premature and reckless. I closed the documents, took a deep breath, and prepared for the next phase. The battlefield was set, the pieces were moving, and I had the leverage they had failed to recognize. Now, it was time to mobilize my knowledge, my legal safeguards, and the evidence I'd gathered. This wouldn't be a fight won with emotion or haste, but with precise, calculated measures. Their attempt to replace me with an unqualified and unauthorized individual wasn't just a professional slight. It was a breach that could unravel their entire operation, and I was ready to make sure they understood exactly what that meant. After gathering the initial evidence, my next step was clear. I needed expert legal counsel, someone who understood the complexities of defense contracting and the sensitive intersection of intellectual property, government regulations, and employment law. I scheduled a consultation with James Harrell, a seasoned employment lawyer with a reputation for navigating the labyrinthine legalities surrounding defense projects. I'd reached out to James years ago during a contract negotiation, and he'd impressed me with his deep knowledge of federal defense regulations and ownership clauses. Now, I needed that expertise more than ever. The morning of our meeting, I arrived at his law office carrying a briefcase heavy with the weight of my professional life. Inside were meticulously organized files, printed copies of the original contract, with its pivotal ownership clause, detailed system architecture blueprints, internal email correspondence revealing the HR and CEO's questionable maneuvers, and encrypted logs showing my digital authorization signatures embedded in the core modules. Every document was color-coded and tabbed for quick reference. I also had digital backups stored on a secure encrypted drive, copies that I'd encrypted with multi-factor authentication. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. James greeted me with a firm handshake and an intensity that matched my urgency. "Kelly, I've reviewed your initial emails. This situation is more complicated than a typical wrongful termination," he said, scanning the thick packet I handed him. "Ownership rights embedded in defense contracts? That's a rare but powerful leverage point. We're not just fighting for your job. We're defending the integrity of a multi-billion-dollar federal program." We spent hours dissecting every piece of evidence. The architecture blueprints revealed how the system's core functions were intertwined with my digital signatures, keys that no one else possessed. Without these, the system couldn't be legally updated, altered, or even fully accessed. James pointed out that this gave me a unique position not just as an employee, but as a proprietary stakeholder with enforceable rights. Next, we reviewed the internal emails and HR documents. The timing of the hiring notice for Mark Caldwell, the simultaneous termination paperwork, and the blatant disregard for clearance protocols painted a clear picture of procedural misconduct. These weren't just grounds for wrongful termination claims. They constituted breaches of federal defense compliance mandates and fiduciary duties owed to the government and clients. James was particularly concerned about the regulatory implications. Unauthorized access attempts by an unqualified individual could trigger investigations, contract suspensions, or heavy penalties. I detailed the encrypted logs and backup keys I'd secured. These weren't just lines of code. They were proof of my exclusive control over the system's security layers. James nodded. "This is critical. We can demonstrate that your termination wasn't just unjust. It's operationally and legally ineffective. The company can't function without your authorization embedded in those keys." I also provided witness statements from senior engineers, colleagues who had voiced concerns internally about Mark's lack of clearance and the risks of bypassing security protocols. Their corroboration strengthened the case that my refusal to train Mark was not insubordination, but adherence to mandatory security standards. Together, James and I mapped out the pressure points. The non-transferable nature of my ownership rights created a legal moat around the system. Any attempt to transfer control or access to Mark without my consent was a contractual breach. Furthermore, the company's actions violated federal regulations governing classified defense projects, exposing Caldwell Defense Solutions to potential fines and contract termination. James advised filing complaints with the Department of Defense's Defense Contract Management Agency and the Defense Security Service. agencies responsible for overseeing compliance and security clearances. He also recommended initiating a breach of contract lawsuit to assert my proprietary rights and challenge the wrongful termination. I left that meeting with a clear strategy and renewed resolve. Over the next days, I continued organizing my digital archives, creating secure backups of encrypted files, system dependency charts, and detailed access logs. I carefully documented every interaction with HR and executives since my termination, knowing that these records could prove crucial in legal hearings. Internally, I sketched a timeline linking every event: the termination notice, Mark's hiring, clearance failures, and system access attempts, tying them back to the ownership clause and regulatory breaches. This map wasn't just for my reference. It was a roadmap for holding Caldwell Defense Solutions accountable. With my team of trusted engineers, I discreetly collected additional witness statements and technical reports detailing Mark's inability to manage classified protocols. These statements would support the claim that my refusal was based on genuine operational risks, not insubordination. Throughout this phase, I kept all communications professional and calm. Every email response to HR requests was carefully worded, neither conceding nor escalating. I was positioning myself strategically, every sentence a calculated move in a complex game. The groundwork was laid. The legal and professional case was taking shape, built on a foundation of irrefutable evidence and unassailable contractual rights. I wasn't just responding to betrayal, I was methodically assembling the tools to turn it into leverage. The true battle for control over the $1.8 billion defense system was only just beginning. James Harrell leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he sifted through the dense packet of documents I'd brought. His office was quiet, except for the soft hum of the computer and the scratch of pen on paper as he took notes. "Kelly," he began, "the layers here are deep. This isn't just a typical wrongful termination case. The crux lies in your proprietary ownership of the system's core modules. That's a rare and powerful position that few employees ever hold." We started by dissecting the contract itself. The ownership clause was embedded in the system development agreement, legally binding and carefully negotiated when the project began. It assigned you exclusive rights over certain critical architecture components, the digital signatures, cryptographic keys, and control modules that essentially acted as the system's heart. James explained, "Without your authorization, these keys can't be transferred or overridden. Any attempt to operate or modify the system without you is not just a violation of corporate policy, it's legally void." That realization shifted everything. Termination papers meant little if the company couldn't function without my digital signature woven into the system's DNA. The contract essentially made me a stakeholder, a gatekeeper whose control stretched beyond mere employment. Next, we turned to the internal emails, the evidentiary backbone revealing a disturbing disregard for compliance. Laura Simmons and Richard Caldwell had orchestrated my termination to swiftly replace me with Mark Caldwell. Despite multiple warnings from senior engineers and compliance officers, the email chains showed them dismissing concerns about Mark's lack of security clearance and inability to handle classified protocols. An internal memo from compliance officials flagged Mark's unauthorized involvement as a direct violation of federal defense regulations, but those warnings were ignored. James noted grimly, ignoring these could expose the company to severe penalties, fines, contract suspensions, or worse. I handed over encrypted access logs, each record stamped with my digital signature, proof that only I had authorized critical modifications or system access. These logs also contained entries where Mark attempted system interactions he was never cleared for, attempted overrides, unauthorized access requests, and failed authentications. "This is critical evidence," James said. "It shows deliberate attempts to bypass security protocols and demonstrates your unique control over the system." Adding weight to the case were witness statements from senior engineers who had documented their concerns about the risk Mark posed to operational security. Their accounts corroborated my refusal to train Mark was based on legitimate security risks, not insubordination. Together, James and I identified the key pressure points to leverage legally and professionally. First was the non-transferable nature of my ownership rights. Any unilateral attempts to hand over control or access without my consent breached the contract. Second, the company's blatant regulatory violations risked federal sanctions. Third, the wrongful termination was executed without cause, masking a strategic attempt to circumvent these protections. James laid out a multi-pronged approach. We would file formal complaints with the Department of Defense oversight agencies, the Defense Contract Management Agency and the Defense Security Service, highlighting the compliance breaches and security risks. Simultaneously, we would initiate a breach of contract lawsuit asserting my proprietary rights over the system's core modules and challenging the legality of my termination. He emphasized meticulous documentation. Every email, every system log, every witness statement strengthens your position. We need airtight evidence to withstand the company's inevitable pushback. I nodded, knowing that the stakes were higher than a job. This was about safeguarding a national security asset and holding Caldwell Defense Solutions accountable for reckless and illegal actions. After the meeting, I returned to my office with a renewed sense of purpose. I continued organizing my digital archives, creating secure backups of encrypted files, system dependency charts, and detailed access logs. I cataloged every interaction since my termination and mapped out a timeline connecting all the critical events. The termination, Mark's precarious onboarding, clearance failures, and unauthorized access attempts. I also reached out discreetly to trusted colleagues, gathering additional technical reports and witness statements to further validate the operational risks Mark's presence introduced. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the foundation of a case that would not just restore my rights, but expose the company's reckless disregard for security and compliance. Throughout this process, I maintained a professional demeanor, responding calmly to HR inquiries without revealing the full extent of my preparations. Each communication was measured, a strategic move in a long game. This was more than a legal battle. It was a contest over control of a billion-dollar defense system, a fight woven from contracts, codes, and classified protocols. The groundwork was laid. The legal and professional case was no longer just a reaction to betrayal. It was a calculated strategy designed to reclaim what was rightfully mine and protect the integrity of a system that millions depended upon. The next moves would determine how far Caldwell Defense Solutions was willing to go to challenge it. Serving those formal notices was a deliberate, calculated step, far from the emotional reaction some might expect after being abruptly fired. I wasn't just reacting, I was asserting control. The day after my meeting with James Harrell, I prepared and dispatched a series of legal notices, each crafted with precision to lay bare the violations Caldwell Defense Solutions had committed. The letters didn't just accuse, they detailed every breach: wrongful termination without cause, the company's blatant disregard for the binding ownership clause assigning me proprietary rights over the $1.8 billion defense system, and the reckless violation of federal regulatory standards governing classified contracts. I sent copies to the company's legal department, the CEO, the HR director Laura Simmons, and crucially to the Defense Contract Management Agency and the Defense Security Service, the federal bodies charged with overseeing compliance on defense contracts. Each letter was a dossier of evidence, excerpts from the original contract, highlighting the non-transferable ownership clause, system architecture diagrams underscoring my exclusive control over critical modules, annotated email exchanges revealing internal warnings about Mark Caldwell's lack of clearance, and documented attempts by Mark to access protocols he was not authorized for. The tone was firm but professional, emphasizing not just legal violations, but the grave operational risks posed by the company's actions. I wasn't just protecting my own interests, I was underscoring the potential national security implications if the system were to be compromised due to unauthorized access or negligent leadership. Parallel to the legal notices, I reached out directly to key defense clients under strict confidentiality agreements. These were the government agencies and defense contractors relying on Caldwell Defense's system for national security operations. I couldn't risk a public scandal, but I also couldn't allow them to be blindsided. I arranged discreet briefings through secure channels, presenting the verifiable facts. The system's core controls were tied to my proprietary keys. The company had replaced me illegally with an unqualified individual lacking proper clearance, and operations were at risk due to this unauthorized management. I stressed that these issues were under legal review and that I was committed to ensuring that any disruption to their operations would be minimized through proper oversight and collaboration. Meanwhile, I secured a new consulting engagement with Titan Defense Systems, a competitor who recognized my expertise and the strategic advantage of having someone intimately familiar with the Caldwell Systems architecture and its vulnerabilities. This wasn't just a fallback. It was a strategic move to maintain financial continuity and industry influence while I navigated the legal labyrinth ahead. The consulting role allowed me to stay connected to the defense community and reinforced my professional standing despite the forced termination. Throughout this period, I maintained a facade of professional compliance in all interactions with Caldwell Defense Solutions. Every email reply to HR or legal inquiries was carefully worded. No admission of fault, no escalation, just courteous acknowledgement and requests for procedural clarifications. I was careful not to reveal the full extent of my preparations, keeping the company unaware of the strategic pressure mounting behind the scenes. Inside, however, I was laser-focused on leveraging the ownership clause and regulatory breaches as the fulcrum to reclaim control. The company, unaware of the depth of my countermeasures, continued pushing forward with their plan to integrate Mark into the system's operations. This blind advance only served to strengthen my position. I documented every system anomaly reported by staff, every internal complaint about Mark's inadequacy, and any attempts to override security protocols without my authorization. These records were painstakingly organized and time-stamped, future ammunition in any legal or regulatory proceedings. At the same time, I stayed in close contact with my legal team and cybersecurity experts who monitored for unauthorized access attempts. Every alert, every log entry was another piece of the puzzle, further exposing the systemic risks Caldwell Defense Solutions was courting. It was a tense waiting game, but I knew that the right moment to strike would come when the consequences of their negligence began to spiral. This phase of action wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. It was about positioning. Every letter sent, every confidential client briefing, every consulting engagement, and every measured communication was a move on a carefully constructed chessboard. The stakes were enormous: a multi-billion-dollar defense project, national security implications, and my own professional legacy all hanging in the balance. I was no longer just a former employee wronged by nepotism and corporate recklessness. I was a strategic stakeholder, quietly mobilizing pressure from legal, regulatory, and client fronts. The battle lines were drawn, and Caldwell Defense Solutions was about to discover that firing me at 8:15 a.m. was only the beginning of a far more complex war. Within barely 2 weeks after my termination, troubling signs began to surface. Small anomalies in the system I had built, subtle glitches that the Caldwell Defense Solutions engineering staff scrambled to explain. It started with intermittent system outages during critical operations. These weren't the usual hiccups of complex software. They were clear disruptions triggered by improper access attempts. What was most concerning was that these errors were flagged at layers of the system where only authorized personnel with Q clearance, like myself, had access privileges. The logs told a story: multiple failed authentication attempts, unauthorized override requests, and access denials tied directly to the CEO's son, Mark Caldwell. I got wind of these incidents through discreet channels. Trusted engineers, some still loyal to me, quietly passed along snippets of error reports and internal memos. The atmosphere within the company shifted palpably. Whispers of concern spread among the technical teams. "Mark can't handle the system," one engineer confided. "He's triggering lockdowns we haven't seen in years." It was the kind of information impossible to ignore. The risks weren't just operational. They were systemic, compromising the integrity of a $1.8 billion national security asset. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense wasn't blind to the disturbances. Their oversight units, the Defense Contract Management Agency, and the Defense Security Service launched preliminary inquiries. Notices arrived formally requesting detailed compliance reports and explanations for the unexpected outages. These reports required transparency about personnel access levels and assurance that no unauthorized individuals were breaching classified protocols. Caldwell Defense Solutions suddenly found itself under federal scrutiny. And the timing couldn't have been worse for Richard Caldwell and his leadership team. I watched these developments unfold with a measured calm. I wasn't involved directly anymore, but I was monitoring every piece of intel meticulously. Each outage report, each DoD inquiry notice, bolstered the legal and regulatory case James and I were building. I kept a comprehensive record of all these communications, copies of every email, meeting minutes, and system logs indicating unauthorized access attempts. This was evidence not just of operational failure, but of gross negligence on the part of Caldwell Defense's management. As the pressure mounted internally, Richard Caldwell began making desperate moves. I started receiving calls from his office, urgent, somewhat anxious, and carefully worded. He requested my consultation to help stabilize the system during this transition. I maintained professional distance, responding through my lawyer with polite referrals to legal counsel and compliance officers. I was no longer available for off-the-record fixes or informal troubleshooting. They knew the stakes were now legal, as much as technical. Within Caldwell Defense's corridors, the mood darkened. Rumors swirled about Mark's repeated failures to meet operational milestones and his inability to gain necessary security clearances. Senior staff who had once been hesitant to speak out began quietly voicing their concerns. The company had to confront the reality that installing an unqualified individual into a role responsible for national security systems was causing tangible harm. I knew from my ongoing communication with cybersecurity consultants that the unauthorized attempts to access the system had triggered automatic lockdown protocols I had designed years ago. These protocols were safeguards meant to prevent any breach of classified modules. Ironically, these lockdowns were now impeding system functionality, causing delays and performance degradation that alarmed key clients relying on the system's flawless operation. Even as Caldwell Defense scrambled to manage the fallout, I stayed resolute and calculated. I carefully documented every emergency call, every internal complaint, every failed access log tied to Mark's credentials. These records became a chronicle of mounting operational risk directly linked to management's reckless decisions. The CEO's confidence visibly wavered in subsequent shareholder meetings and internal briefings. Behind closed doors, whispers of doubt about leadership competence circulated, a far cry from Richard's earlier bravado. Every incident strengthened my position. The unauthorized access attempts weren't mere technical glitches. They were symptomatic of a leadership failure to adhere to federal security regulations and contractual obligations. By forcing Mark into a role without clearance or experience, Caldwell Defense Solutions had compromised not only operational stability, but also legal compliance, exposing themselves to potential contract suspensions or penalties from the DoD. Yet, outwardly, I maintained a careful balance, professional, unobtrusive, and ready to leverage the growing crisis at the appropriate moment. This wasn't just about personal vindication anymore. It was about safeguarding a critical defense system and holding reckless leadership accountable. The stakes were national security, corporate integrity, and the enormous responsibility that came with architecting a system embedded deeply within the country's defense infrastructure. As the inquiry deepened and the outages persisted, I prepared for the next phase of this complex battle. The chessboard was set, and Caldwell Defense Solutions was beginning to understand that dismissing me had ignited a series of consequences far beyond a simple personnel shuffle. The fallout was no longer hypothetical. It was unfolding, tangible, and irreversible, and I was ready. The day we filed the lawsuit was a defining moment, not just a legal formality, but a strategic strike aimed squarely at exposing the magnitude of Caldwell Defense Solutions' recklessness. The complaint outlined $6 million in compensatory damages, a figure carefully calculated to cover not only my lost wages and severance, but also the punitive impact of their blatant disregard for contractual and regulatory obligations. More importantly, it detailed the regulatory fines that loomed over the company, penalties that could cripple their multi-billion-dollar contracts if the Department of Defense decided to enforce them fully. This lawsuit wasn't just about me. It was about the integrity of a national security asset that Caldwell Defense had gambled away on nepotism and cost-cutting. We included irrefutable evidence, system architecture diagrams showing how control of the core modules was inextricably tied to my digital signatures, internal email threads proving repeated warnings about Mark Caldwell's unqualified involvement, and logs showing unauthorized access attempts that violated federal defense protocols. Every document was a brick in a fortress of accountability, designed to prevent the company from sweeping this under the rug. Almost immediately after filing, the Department of Defense's oversight agencies expanded their investigation. The Defense Contract Management Agency and the Defense Security Service sent formal notices demanding comprehensive compliance reports and access logs. The inquiry wasn't just administrative. It threatened to suspend Caldwell's contracts unless they could demonstrate strict adherence to the clearance and access controls mandated by federal law. The stakes had escalated from a personnel dispute to a potential national security crisis. Internally, the atmosphere at Caldwell Defense shifted dramatically. Richard Caldwell's confident facade began to crack as the consequences of his decisions cascaded around him. Emergency meetings were convened, executives scrambled to patch together compliance reports, and whispered conversations turned into urgent debates over damage control. I could sense the mounting pressure through indirect channels. Messages from former colleagues, leaked snippets of frantic internal memos, even the sudden awkward attempts by HR to reopen lines of communication with me, all met with polite but firm refusals. My legal team kept communication tight. I was no longer accessible for informal mediation or technical consulting. Every step I took was guided by counsel, calculated to maximize leverage without giving Caldwell Defense any foothold. Meanwhile, the fallout permeated the engineering teams. Reports surfaced that Mark Caldwell's repeated attempts to access the system were triggering automatic lockdowns, fail-safe protocols I had built to activate whenever unauthorized access was detected. These security measures, once dormant, now repeatedly disrupted system performance, causing delays and outages that alarmed key defense clients. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very safeguards I designed to protect the system were now the source of operational headaches, all because of reckless leadership decisions. Behind the scenes, I coordinated with cybersecurity experts who monitored system logs around the clock. Their findings underscored the severity of the situation. Mark's credentialed attempts to override critical modules were not only unauthorized, but also attempted with a troubling level of persistence, suggesting a dangerous underestimation of protocol boundaries within Caldwell's leadership. Every failed authentication and triggered lockdown was meticulously recorded, forming a timeline that mapped the company's spiraling compliance failures. In the midst of this turmoil, Richard Caldwell made several overtures attempting to negotiate behind the scenes. I received carefully worded letters proposing settlement talks and even hints at reinstatement, a desperate bid to quiet the storm before it fully engulfed the company. But my response was deliberate, measured. My lawyers will be in touch. There was no room for shortcuts or compromises that ignored the scale of violations and risks involved. The evidence we had assembled was too compelling to allow for quiet resolutions. The lawsuit and the expanding DoD investigation also triggered a ripple effect among Caldwell's clients. Several government agencies began demanding independent system audits, a formidable challenge for Caldwell Defense given the ongoing security breaches and compliance gaps. Some clients postponed payments pending the outcomes of these reviews, applying financial pressure that reverberated through the company's bottom line. Industry peers watched closely, aware that the unfolding situation could reset expectations for corporate governance and compliance in defense contracting. Throughout this period, I maintained a facade of calm professionalism. Every communication with Caldwell Defense's legal team was precise. Every public statement, carefully crafted by my counsel to reinforce the legitimacy and seriousness of my claims without inflaming tensions. I knew that patience and discipline were critical. The battle wasn't won by emotion or haste, but by persistence and unassailable proof. As the investigation deepened and the lawsuit progressed, Caldwell Defense Solutions found itself exposed on multiple fronts: legal, regulatory, operational, and reputational. The company's attempts to sideline me had backfired spectacularly, unleashing a cascade of consequences that threatened not only their lucrative contracts, but the very trust of their clients and the defense community. And while all this unfolded, I stayed focused, methodical, unwavering. The fight was far from over. But the tide was shifting unmistakably, and those who thought they could erase me overnight had underestimated the power of documented rights, strategic resolve, and the law. The next moves in this high-stakes game would test Caldwell Defense's will to survive, and my readiness to ensure that justice in its fullest sense was served. Richard Caldwell's once unshakable grip on Caldwell Defense Solutions began to crumble under the weight of mounting regulatory sanctions and the exodus of key clients. The very foundation he had built his leadership on, the promise of steady growth and decisive control, started to fracture as the fallout from his reckless decisions reverberated throughout the company and the defense industry at large. The resignation wasn't a quiet departure. It came after a series of emergency board meetings where the directors confronted a stark reality. Richard's insistence on installing his son Mark in a critical systems role without proper clearance or qualifications had placed the company's $1.8 billion defense contract and its reputation in jeopardy. The board, under intense pressure from federal oversight agencies, shareholders, and alarmed clients, deemed his position untenable. The announcement was terse but unequivocal. Richard was stepping down immediately. His exit was framed as a necessary step toward restoring trust and compliance. But the underlying message was clear. His leadership had become a liability. The regulatory penalties that followed were severe. The Department of Defense's Defense Contract Management Agency and Defense Security Service, after exhaustive investigations, levied fines totaling $8 million against Caldwell Defense Solutions. These penalties reflected not only the violations related to improper personnel management and unauthorized system access, but also the broader breaches of federal defense compliance and security protocols. The financial hit was compounded by mandatory contract renegotiations, requiring Caldwell Defense to overhaul its internal security procedures and submit to heightened oversight. The company's ability to bid on future contracts hung in the balance, as the DoD made it clear that any further lapses would result in contract termination. Within the company, the fallout went beyond regulatory and financial repercussions. Laura Simmons, the HR director who had played a pivotal role in the expedited termination and onboarding process, was swiftly dismissed for procedural misconduct and failure to adhere to due process. Her termination sent a stark message internally. Shortcuts and collusion at the expense of compliance and ethics would not be tolerated. The HR department underwent immediate restructuring, with new policies introduced to ensure strict adherence to security clearance protocols and employment law. Public exposure of the scandal further damaged Caldwell Defense Solutions' standing in the defense community. Industry publications and trade journals picked up the story, dissecting how nepotism and poor executive judgment had imperiled a critical national security asset. Headlines highlighted the systemic failures, how an unqualified individual was pushed into a role that demanded the highest levels of security clearance and expertise, leading to operational disruptions and regulatory penalties. The resulting reputational damage made clients wary, and several sent representatives to conduct independent audits, delaying contract renewals and payments. The internal scramble to stabilize operations was chaotic. Mark Caldwell, stripped of clearance and sidelined from any secure role, was reassigned to non-sensitive administrative duties, a demotion symbolic of the company's acknowledgement of their misstep. Meanwhile, senior engineers and compliance officers who had voiced concerns earlier found their warnings vindicated. The team began painstaking efforts to patch security gaps, restore system stability, and rebuild client confidence, an uphill battle complicated by the loss of trust and leadership turmoil. Financial audits conducted in the wake of the scandal uncovered further troubling details. Richard's attempts to conceal assets and obscure financial irregularities tied to the handling of contracts and vendor relationships surfaced, adding fuel to the legal and regulatory fire. These findings intensified scrutiny not only from defense regulators, but also from federal prosecutors investigating potential fraud and corruption. The company was forced to cooperate fully, diverting resources from critical engineering and client support functions. Amid this upheaval, I secured a significant legal victory. The court awarded me $1.4 million in damages, including back pay, severance, and compensation for the professional and reputational harm I suffered. More importantly, the judgment reinstated my proprietary ownership rights over the core system modules, reaffirming the binding nature of the contract clause that had been at the heart of the dispute. This legal recognition restored my formal control over the architecture keys and digital signatures embedded in the defense system, reinforcing the operational and legal barriers against any unauthorized access or modification. The victory was not merely personal. It sent ripples across the defense contracting landscape, signaling to other firms and professionals the critical importance of respecting documented ownership rights and compliance obligations. Caldwell Defense Solutions' missteps became a cautionary tale, frequently cited at industry conferences and in professional forums, underscoring the risks inherent in nepotism and regulatory neglect. As the dust settled, the company's leadership was forced to rebuild from the ground up. New executives with strong compliance backgrounds were brought in, and comprehensive training programs on security clearances and contractual obligations were instituted. Client contracts were renegotiated with tougher oversight provisions, and independent auditors were embedded within project teams to ensure transparency and adherence to federal mandates. Throughout this turbulent period, I remained focused on my personal and professional recovery, using the legal victory as a platform to reassert my expertise and integrity within the industry. The $1.4 million award was more than compensation. It was validation of the years I had dedicated to building and protecting a system vital to national defense. Yet, the battle was far from over. The professional and ethical lessons from this ordeal would continue to shape my approach as I planned the next chapters of my career. The consequences faced by Caldwell Defense Solutions were severe and multifaceted, but the story was still unfolding. The operational, legal, and reputational aftershocks of this scandal would influence defense contracting practices for years to come, and I knew that my role as a custodian of this system and of professional integrity was far from concluded. The stakes remained as high as ever, and every decision going forward would be measured against the hard-earned lessons of this crisis. The courtroom was charged with a quiet intensity the day the final judgment was handed down, a legal reckoning years in the making, crystallizing the complex battle that had unfolded between me and Caldwell Defense Solutions. Sitting at the center of this storm, I felt a mix of vindication and responsibility. The judge's ruling wasn't just a personal victory, it was a reaffirmation of the principles that had guided me through every step: meticulous documentation, contractual clarity, and unwavering professionalism. The court awarded me $1.4 million in damages. This sum encompassed back pay for my wrongful termination, severance compensation, and restitution for the reputational harm inflicted by a corporate culture that had sought to erase me without regard for legal or ethical boundaries. More critically, the judgment fully reinstated my proprietary ownership rights over the system's core modules, those essential architectural components and digital keys embedded deeply within the $1.8 billion defense system. The ruling made it absolutely clear: Caldwell Defense Solutions could not operate or modify the system without my authorization. This was no longer just an employment dispute. It was a legal acknowledgement that my stake in the system transcended typical employee boundaries. On the regulatory front, the repercussions for Caldwell Defense Solutions were swift and severe. The Department of Defense agencies overseeing the contract imposed $8 million in fines, a penalty reflecting the gravity of their violations. These were not merely financial sanctions, but a public statement about the company's failure to uphold federal security clearances and compliance mandates. The fines underscored the risks introduced by installing unqualified personnel in classified roles and neglecting contractual ownership clauses that protect national security assets. Caldwell Defense's reputation within the defense community took a serious hit, sending ripples through their client base and the broader industry. Richard Caldwell, once the unshakable CEO, found himself blacklisted from future defense contracting opportunities. His forced resignation and the resulting fallout illustrated how leadership miscalculations and nepotism could dismantle years of corporate progress. The board's decision to remove him was a direct consequence of his disregard for compliance and professional expertise. His legacy became a cautionary tale, one frequently cited in defense industry circles as an example of what happens when ambition outpaces responsibility. Within Caldwell Defense, the tremors extended beyond financial penalties and leadership changes. Laura Simmons, the HR director who had expedited my termination without due process, was terminated for procedural misconduct. Her dismissal sent a clear message: cutting corners on compliance and ethics would not be tolerated. The HR department underwent significant restructuring, with new policies emphasizing adherence to federal clearance protocols and employment laws, aiming to restore trust internally and externally. Industry publications and defense forums quickly picked up the story, dissecting every misstep. Articles highlighted how the attempt to replace an irreplaceable expert with an unqualified family member jeopardized a critical national security asset. These reports hardened client skepticism and prompted many to demand independent audits and increased oversight on sensitive projects. The scandal became a case study in the risks of nepotism and the vital importance of honoring documented ownership rights, a lesson not lost on competitors and regulatory agencies alike. Mark Caldwell's professional trajectory was irreversibly altered. Stripped of clearance and responsibility for classified systems, he was relegated to non-secure administrative duties, a demotion symbolizing the company's acknowledgement of his unsuitability for the role he had been forced into. His presence no longer posed a systemic risk, but the shadow his appointment cast over the company's reputation lingered. Financial audits revealed more than just compliance failures. Richard Caldwell's attempts to conceal assets and obscure irregularities related to contract management came to light, triggering further investigations by federal authorities. These discoveries compounded Caldwell Defense's troubles, adding layers of legal and regulatory scrutiny that extended beyond my case. The company was compelled to cooperate fully with investigators, diverting crucial resources from project development and client support. My legal victory was more than just a monetary settlement. The court's recognition of my proprietary rights restored formal control over the system's architecture keys and digital signatures, reaffirming the contractual safeguards I had built into the project. This reinstatement fortified my position as both a technical expert and a legal stakeholder, ensuring that any future changes to the system would require my explicit consent. It was a powerful validation of the strategic foresight and professionalism that had underpinned my career. The outcome sent waves through the defense contracting sector. Firms began re-evaluating their internal policies on intellectual property rights and compliance procedures. My case was cited at industry conferences and in professional forums as a precedent, underscoring the critical importance of respecting documented ownership clauses and following stringent clearance protocols. The reverberations encouraged a more careful balancing of executive ambitions with operational realities and legal obligations. As Caldwell Defense Solutions scrambled to rebuild, they brought in new executives with strong compliance backgrounds to lead a cultural overhaul. Comprehensive training programs on security clearance procedures and contractual responsibilities were instituted. Client contracts were renegotiated under heightened scrutiny, with independent auditors embedded in key projects to ensure transparency and accountability. The company's path to redemption would be long and deliberate. Throughout these seismic shifts in the company and industry, I remained focused on rebuilding my professional life. The legal affirmation of my rights and the financial compensation allowed me to reassert my expertise and integrity, positioning me as a trusted leader in the defense community. The experience deepened my appreciation for the power of careful documentation, contractual nuances, and strategic patience. Though the courtroom doors had closed on this chapter, the lessons and implications were far from over. The defense industry had been reminded, loudly and clearly, that competence, documented rights, and adherence to compliance are paramount. For me, this victory was a milestone, but also a renewed commitment to uphold these principles in whatever comes next. The stakes remain high, the system's integrity preserved, and my role as a custodian of both technological excellence and professional ethics firmly established. The battle changed the landscape, but the war for trust and security in defense contracting continues, and I am ready. Today, I stand not just as a survivor of that brutal corporate upheaval, but as a lead consultant at Titan Defense Systems, a position that, truth be told, is far more rewarding than my previous role at Caldwell ever was. My salary has increased by 35%, yes, but beyond the numbers, what truly matters is the equity ownership I hold in several new defense projects. This stake isn't just financial. It's a testament to how much Titan values the unique expertise and strategic insight I bring, especially after everything I went through. I'm no longer just an employee. I am a partner, a decision-maker, and a guardian of the kind of systems that shape national security. The key difference now is control, real control. I maintain full authority over architectural keys, the same kind of digital signature access that once locked down Caldwell's $1.8 billion defense system. Here, the protocols and safeguards are not just about security clearance. They're about respecting documented ownership and ensuring that no unauthorized hands can tamper with critical infrastructure. It's a direct reflection of the lessons I learned during that storm, how important it is to embed legal and procedural protections alongside technological ones. My name is literally on the core modules, and that fact carries weight, responsibility, and security that no one disputes. My role at Titan also goes beyond architecture and system design. I serve as a consultant on compliance strategy, helping them navigate the complex, often unforgiving landscape of federal defense contracts. I work closely with legal teams to ensure every clause, every protocol is airtight, and that no corners are cut in a way that could jeopardize national security or the company's reputation. This advisory role is deeply satisfying. It's a way for me to translate past hard-won experience into forward-looking safeguards for projects worth billions. Reflecting on everything, what stands out is the power of meticulous documentation and the sometimes underestimated value of contractual nuance. Those encrypted archives, the digital signatures, the ownership clauses, they weren't just lines on a paper or strings of code. They were shields, weapons, and keys, all at once. Without them, I might have walked away with nothing but a bruised ego and a severance check. Instead, they became the foundation of a professional recalibration and a legal fortress that no one could breach. Strategic patience was crucial. I never let anger dictate my moves. Instead, I stayed calm, measured, and methodical, knowing every step, every communication, every legal filing would ripple far beyond the immediate moment. In corporate warfare, especially in fields as sensitive as defense contracting, impulsiveness is a liability. The calm professionalism I maintained was my greatest asset, allowing me to build a case as formidable as the systems I designed. Today, I'm stronger and more respected in the industry than ever before. Colleagues and clients alike recognize not just my technical expertise, but my integrity and resilience under pressure. I'm invited to speak at conferences, mentor younger engineers, and weigh in on policy discussions about intellectual property rights and security compliance. The narrative has shifted from being the professional who was fired for standing her ground to the expert who reclaimed her rightful place through knowledge, foresight, and unshakable professionalism. What I take away from this experience is a renewed commitment to uphold these principles. The defense industry is unforgiving, with stakes that extend far beyond profit margins. Here, every line of code, every contractual clause, every security protocol carries consequences that affect lives and national security. My journey reaffirmed that competence, documented rights, and strategic vigilance are not just career assets, they are imperatives. There is no room for shortcuts or compromises when the systems you build hold such immense responsibility. I remain vigilant, aware that the landscape will continue to evolve and that new challenges will arise, but I face them equipped not just with experience, but with the hard-earned knowledge that calm professionalism and contractual clarity can prevail even against the most daunting odds. I'm Kelly Lambert, and while the battles continue, both for the integrity of our defense systems and for the values that underpin them, I move forward confident, secure, and more empowered than ever.